51 days. That's not a missing persons case anymore. That's a system that either failed Nancy Guthrie or was designed to fail her. Tonight, we are not speculating. Tonight, we are stacking evidence. And what you're going to see, piece by piece, is that someone knew this neighborhood. Someone knew this house. Someone knew exactly which cameras were watching and which ones weren't. Think about this. The dogs in this neighborhood didn't bark on a random Tuesday night. They barked on January 11th, then again on January 31st. The same unusual behavior, 20 days apart. And both times, cameras in the immediate area happened to be offline. That is not coincidence. In criminal law, there is no such thing. What we have tonight are 3 separate lines of evidence that, when placed side by side, stop looking like fragments and start looking like a blueprint. A neighbor's testimony, mysterious ridges in the driveway where the blood trail ends, and a figure on a porch who turns his head not toward a sound, not toward a light, but toward something he was already expecting. Someone was waiting. Before we go further, if you've been following this case and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every night we're here, we're adding pieces. You don't want to miss what comes next. Let's get into it. 4 houses down. That's how close one of Nancy Guthrie's neighbors lives to the home where she vanished. Not 4 blocks, 4 houses. And for years before any of this happened, he and his wife would pass Nancy on their evening walks, both of them out with their dogs, exchanging the kind of quiet greetings that define a neighborhood where people actually know each other. Nancy Guthrie was not a stranger to him. She was the woman down the street, pleasant, warm, present. Then one morning, the helicopters came. He didn't know what was happening at first. None of the neighbors did. Search and rescue crews combing the brush, sheriff's deputies flooding the streets, volunteers from the mountain rescue teams, the kind who pull lost hikers out of the Tucson wilderness, now walking the same sidewalks where Nancy used to stroll. And then the name came through. Their neighbor, the woman with the dog, gone. Now here's what matters. This neighbor didn't have to come forward. He didn't have to go on television, put his face out there, describe his cameras and his backyard and the terrain behind his home. Most people don't. In over a decade prosecuting violent felonies, that pattern never changed the people who see something, who hear something, who feel something wrong in their gut. They stay quiet. They tell themselves it's not their place. They file it away and move on. This neighbor didn't do that. What he brought to this investigation is something no forensic test can manufacture: proximity, pattern recognition, and the kind of detail that only comes from someone who was actually there, actually awake, actually paying attention. His dogs woke him up. Not once, twice. January 11th. Then, January 31st, the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Both nights, his dogs sound sleepers by habit, animals that he routinely takes out before bed, and not again until morning both nights. They roused him after 1 a.m. and demanded to go outside. He took them to the rear courtyard, the small enclosed space that abuts the back bedroom. And both times, on the camera footage he later reviewed with investigators, you can see it. The dog, standing still, not barking, not running, just fixed, staring out toward the dense brush and cactus and rock that separates his property from Nancy Guthrie's, 150 yards away. That's the estimated distance between his rear yard and the top of Nancy's roofline, through terrain he described as inhospitable, dense palo verde, cactus, rough brush. In the dark, nearly impassable, unless you already knew exactly where you were going. The dog knew something was out there. He didn't. Not that night. Not until weeks later when the FBI sat down with him, walked his yard, and asked him to go back through his footage, looking for anything unusual on 2 specific dates. That's when the correlation hit. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. 2 of his cameras were offline on the nights in question, not malfunctioning, not blurry, offline. He didn't discover this on his own. He found out when he sat down with investigators, and they flagged the notation in the system data. 2 cameras, both nights, gone, now. You can call that a technical glitch. You can call it a coincidence. But we've already established what coincidences mean in criminal investigations. The question isn't whether someone was moving through that neighborhood on January 11th and January 31st. The question is, what were they doing there 20 days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared? And who else in that neighborhood had cameras that went dark? There's a detail in this neighbor's testimony that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. When he described the terrain behind his home, the rough brush, the cactus, the dense scrub stretching toward Nancy Guthrie's property, he made a point of saying it would be a challenge to navigate, especially in the dark, especially without knowing what you were walking into, unless someone had already mapped it out. That phrase. Sit with it for a moment, because what he described next reframes everything. Behind the cluster of homes on that street, there is a service road, a utility corridor maintained by the power company, running alongside the properties, largely invisible from the main street. That service road connects to a cul-de-sac, and that cul-de-sac runs along the side of Nancy Guthrie's property. This is not a theoretical path. This is a path that people have been using for years. The neighbor mentioned it almost in passing school children, he said. For a long time, kids in that neighborhood would cut through that corridor to reach the school bus instead of walking the long way around on the street. It was common knowledge, local knowledge, the kind of thing you only know if you've spent time in that neighborhood, talked to people who live there, or walked it yourself. Now think about what that means. If someone wanted to approach Nancy Guthrie's home from the rear, avoiding the main street, avoiding the ring cameras on the front of neighboring houses, avoiding any direct line of sight from passing vehicles, that service, road, and cul-de-sac combination would give them almost perfect cover. Move on foot through the utility corridor, cut to the cul-de-sac, come up alongside the property from the rear, enter through the back. Brian Fitzgibbons, Director of Operations at USPA Nationwide Security, put it plainly. That cut-through would provide good concealment, moving on foot toward the southeast, toward Nancy's backyard, with cover from the cameras positioned on neighboring properties. Relatively navigable at night. With that dirt road as a guide, even in darkness, someone who had walked it before would have no trouble. And that brings us directly back to January 11th. 20 days before Nancy Guthrie vanished, something caused the neighbors' dogs to wake up after 1 a.m. and demand to go outside. Something in the direction of that rear yard. Something in the direction of that brush and rock and cactus between his property and hers. The FBI flagged that date specifically. They asked about it. They walked the yard and assessed the terrain themselves. The investigators weren't treating January 11th as background noise. They were treating it as a rehearsal. Now add the vacant home. The neighbor identified it clearly on the aerial map caddy corner across the street, right around the corner from Nancy Guthrie. A property with no occupants, no one to notice an unfamiliar vehicle parked nearby, no one to question a person sitting in a car after dark, watching the street, timing the rhythms of the neighborhood. And then add the construction site visible straight up the street from Nancy's front door, at the top of the cul-de-sac above Escalante. Active crews. Equipment, foot traffic that wouldn't look unusual during the day. A location with direct sight lines to her home that could serve as an observation point without drawing a single second glance. Vacant property, construction activity, service road, cul-de-sac, a cut-through that locals have known about for decades. This is not a neighborhood someone stumbled into. The neighbor also mentioned something that passed quickly but deserves far more weight. On the Saturday evening before Nancy disappeared walking the dogs, early evening, he and his wife noticed a car parked on Escalante. Not in a driveway, not in front of a specific house, in a small gravel cutout about 50 yards past Nancy's home, a spot where people occasionally park when they walk their dogs through the area. He couldn't provide much detail. Human nature, he said, you notice something, but you want to be accurate, and the specifics don't stick until something forces you to go back and look. But the car was there, parked, on the street where Nancy Guthrie lived. Days before she vanished, someone was learning this neighborhood the same way a detective learns a crime scene, methodically, patiently, on foot and by vehicle, in daylight and after dark. The dogs knew on January 11th. The cameras went offline on January 11th, and 20 days later, the plan was executed. What we still don't know is how long before January 11th the surveillance actually began. Watch the video one more time. Not the part everyone fixates on, not the figure pulling weeds from the doorstep, not the bite light, not the question of whether that shape on his wrist is a watch or a tattoo. Watch the moment after he stands up. Watch where his head goes. He turns, deliberately, over his left shoulder, back toward the street, and in that direction, faint, partially obscured, but their 2 points of light sit in the background of the frame. This detail did not come from law enforcement. It did not come from the FBI's official analysis or from Sheriff Nanos's press briefings. It came from a user on X, screen name Blue Star 812, who sat with that footage frame by frame and noticed something the professional investigators either missed or chose not to address publicly. The online sleuth community found it, not the people whose entire job it was to find it. Now here's the problem with that. Todd Shipley, digital cybercrime expert and former detective sergeant with 25 years in law enforcement, was direct about what this reveals. When investigators analyzed that porch video, he said they focused on the subject, the person, the gun, the sleeve, the details that confirmed what they already believed they were looking at. And in doing so, they applied a bias, a tunnel vision that caused them to miss what was sitting in plain sight behind him. The background, the context, the bigger picture. That is not a minor oversight. That is a fundamental failure of video analysis. Because if those lights are a vehicle, if that is a car sitting on Escalante with its engine running and its headlights on while the figure on the porch goes through his routine, then everything about this scene changes. The timeline changes. The number of people involved changes. The entire operational structure of what happened to Nancy Guthrie that night changes. Think about this. The figure on the porch spends a significant amount of time outside before Nancy Guthrie is brought out. He pulls weeds. He examines the door. He moves slowly, deliberately, without apparent urgency. For a man allegedly in the middle of a kidnapping, he is remarkably calm. Why? Brian Fitzgibbons offered the most logical answer. The vehicle wasn't there yet, or it had arrived and then pulled back, and the figure on the porch was waiting killing time, maintaining the appearance of casual activity until the signal came that the car was in position. That glance over the shoulder wasn't random. It was a check. And the moment those lights appeared in the background of the frame, the operation moved forward. Now, the question of accomplices. A theory circulating from a retired FBI source suggested as many as 5 people could be involved in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. 5. That number strains credibility, and not because the crime wasn't sophisticated enough to require multiple people. It strains credibility because of what's sitting in a bank account somewhere in Tucson waiting to be claimed. $1.2 million. That is the reward currently offered for information leading to Nancy Guthrie. And as Fitzgibbons noted, with that kind of money on the table, a 5-person conspiracy becomes its own worst enemy. 5 people means 5 sets of loyalties. 5 people who each have a girlfriend, a brother, a cellmate, a neighbor who might decide that $1.2 million is more valuable than silence. 5 people means 5 potential breaking points. The more likely scenario, based on the evidence as it exists, is 2 to 3 individuals. 1 to enter the home and bring out Nancy Guthrie, 1 to manage the vehicle, possibly 1 more as a coordinator or lookout, small enough to hold together, large enough to execute what was clearly a multi-step, pre-planned operation. And that figure on the porch, the one pulling weeds in the early hours of the morning, the one who glanced back at those headlights, he was not the architect of this. He was the one who went in, which means somewhere behind those headlights, someone else was watching, someone who stayed off camera, someone who knew the neighborhood, knew the timing, knew which cameras were offline and which ones weren't, someone who had been here before. The porch video doesn't just show us a suspect. It shows us the edge of a larger operation, and the lights in the background are the first hard evidence that the edge exists. What we don't yet have is what those lights are attached to. A vehicle that was recorded somewhere else that night, a plate number, a direction of travel. The metadata on that video could tell us exactly when those lights appeared in the frame, down to the second. And as of tonight, that metadata has not been released. The blood stops, and then the tracks begin. That sequence, that specific, documented sequence, is the detail that transforms 2 separate pieces of evidence into a single narrative. And once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with what we know. In the gravel and aggregate surface in front of Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators and online researchers identified 2 parallel lines. Narrow, deep, remarkably straight, running in a single consistent direction without curving, without drifting, without the kind of irregular pressure variation you'd expect from something dragged or pushed carelessly across an uneven surface. These are not scuff marks. These are not footprints. These are load-bearing wheel impressions, and they tell a story about weight, direction, and intent. Joseph Scott Morgan, professor of forensics at Jacksonville State University and a death investigator with over 10,000 documented death scenes, broke it down with precision. The first thing he identified was wheelbase, the distance between the center points of the 2 parallel ruts. In motor vehicle accident reconstruction, wheelbase is one of the primary measurements used to identify a specific vehicle. The same principle applies here. Measure the distance between those two lines, match it against known equipment, and you begin to narrow the field. What he ruled out is just as important as what he didn't. A standard two-wheeled wheelbarrow, the kind you'd find on any construction site, has tires that are too wide to produce ruts this narrow. The double-wheeled garden barrow, same problem. What these marks suggest is something with a very tight gauge, a very narrow tire profile, something designed to carry weight on a slim footprint. A wheelchair fits that profile. A medical transport dolly fits that profile. A collapsible equipment cart, the kind used to move heavy appliances through tight spaces, fits that profile. Now, here's where it gets forensically significant. Morgan raised a question that reframes the entire physical evidence picture. Do these ruts show a difference in depth between two passes, one pass lighter, one pass heavier? Because if the tracks going toward the house show less compression than the tracks going away from the house, that is direct physical evidence of weight being added between the two passes. Something or someone was loaded onto that device inside the home, and the gravel recorded it. That analysis has not been publicly confirmed. But the question itself is exactly the right one. And the fact that it hasn't been answered publicly tells you something about what the FBI may or may not be sitting on. Then there is the matter of the cast. We learned that federal investigators attempted to make a cast of the tire impressions and were unable to do so successfully. Morgan confirmed why. The surface composition loose gravel aggregate over what appears to be a cement base makes casting essentially impossible. Pour dental stone into that surface, and what you pull up is a mass of loose rock with no readable impression. The gravel gives way. The detail is destroyed in the extraction. Photography is the only viable method. Photograph from multiple angles. Photograph with controlled side lighting to maximize shadow depth in the ruts. Photograph with a scale marker for measurement reference. If that was done correctly and early enough before weather, before foot traffic, before any further contamination of the scene, then the images exist. Somewhere in the FBI's evidence archive, there are photographs of those marks taken with enough detail to produce meaningful measurements. The question is whether those measurements have been matched against anything, because here is what the gravel cannot tell us on its own. It cannot tell us what made those marks. It can only tell us the dimensions of what made those marks: the wheelbase, the tire width, the depth of impression relative to the weight being carried. Those three numbers, taken together, produce a profile. And that profile either matches a piece of equipment that was present in that neighborhood on the construction site, in the vacant home, in a vehicle parked on Escalante, or it doesn't. If it matches, that is physical evidence connecting a specific object to the scene. If it doesn't match anything locally sourced, then someone brought that equipment with them, planned for it, loaded it into a vehicle before they ever arrived on Escalante. Which means the operation wasn't just surveilled in advance, it was logistically prepared in advance. And then there is the blood. The blood trail that has been documented in front of Nancy Guthrie's home ends at a specific point, not gradually, not in a diminishing scatter pattern that suggests movement continuing beyond the frame. It ends. And according to the visual evidence available, the wheel marks pick up in proximity to that endpoint. Morgan's framing of this was precise. Is there concurrence between where the blood trail ends and where the ruts begin? Because if there is, if those two lines of evidence terminate and originate at the same point in the gravel, then what you have is not two separate pieces of evidence. What you have is a single documented moment. The moment Nancy Guthrie stopped moving under her own power. And the moment something else took over. 3 measurements in the gravel: wheelbase, tire width, depth under load. Somewhere, there is a piece of equipment that produced exactly those 3 numbers. And whoever brought it to Escalante that night knew they were going to need it before they ever left home. For weeks, one narrative dominated the discussion around how someone entered Nancy Guthrie's home. The wrought iron screen door, people said. The heavy security door at the front entrance. Impenetrable, reinforced. The kind of barrier that gives a homeowner the feeling of safety, even when everything outside is uncertain. And because that door looked solid, because it looked serious, the assumption hardened into accepted fact. Whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home did not come through the front. That assumption is wrong. Terry Wynn Yates is a third-generation master locksmith with over 25 years of experience. His family has been in this profession long enough that picking locks isn't a skill, it's inherited muscle memory. And when he looked at the lock on Nancy Guthrie's wrought iron door, his assessment was immediate and unambiguous. An amateur could open that lock in minutes, a professional in seconds. Let that sit for a moment, not hours. Not with specialized equipment that takes weeks to source, minutes for someone with basic knowledge, seconds for someone who does this for a living or has practiced with any seriousness. The top deadbolt and the bottom key knob on that door, Win Yates said, those are the first locks his apprentices train on. Within the first hour of instruction, they are picking those locks. It is where locksmiths begin because it is the simplest possible starting point. The door that looked impenetrable was, in the language of the trade, a beginner's exercise. Now, here's the problem with everything that came before this revelation. Every theory that routed the perpetrator exclusively through the back, through the sliding glass door that Sheriff Nanos confirmed was found open, was built on the premise that the front entrance was too difficult to breach. Remove that premise and the entire entry scenario opens back up. Both doors become viable entry and exit points simultaneously. One person through the back, one person managing the front, or a single person who entered through the back and exited through the front with Nancy Guthrie. Win Yates walked through the mechanics with clinical detail. There are two primary methods for picking a standard pin tumbler lock. The first is raking, a technique where the pick is moved rapidly in and out, while rotational tension is applied, setting multiple pins simultaneously through repeated contact. It is fast, it is imprecise, and in the hands of someone even moderately practiced, it is devastatingly effective on a standard residential lock. The second method is single pin picking, more deliberate, more controlled. The picker works through each of the 5 pins in sequence, setting them one at a time until the cylinder rotates. It takes longer than raking, it requires more skill, but it produces something raking cannot always guarantee: silence. No forced entry, no broken frame, no scratched metal, no sound that would carry through a wall or wake a neighbor. The lock opens, the door swings, and from the outside, nothing looks disturbed. Then there is the lockpick gun. Older technology, Win Yates acknowledged there are more refined methods available now, but still effective and still widely used. The mechanism is simple, a spring-loaded pick that vibrates against the pins rapidly, essentially bumping them into alignment while tension is applied. It works in seconds. It requires minimal skill to operate, and it is, as Win Yates noted, readily available. Not on the black market, not through specialized criminal supply chains, online. Openly, anyone can purchase one. The one meaningful drawback of the lockpick gun is noise. It clicks. It rattles. In a quiet residential neighborhood at 1-0 inches the morning, that sound carries differently than it would in a busy urban environment. Which brings us to a specific implication that has not been discussed enough. If the perpetrator used a lockpick gun on Nancy Guthrie's front door, a neighbor close enough and awake at the right moment might have heard something. A series of clicks. A metallic rattling that didn't fit the ambient sound of the neighborhood at that hour. Something that registered as odd but not immediately alarming, the kind of sound that gets filed away and forgotten unless something later forces you to go back and examine it. And if the perpetrator knew that noise was a liability, if they were skilled enough or cautious enough to use manual picking instead, then what they left behind at that door is almost nothing. A few micro-abrasions on the pin chambers that only a forensic locksmith examining the hardware under magnification would detect. Has that examination been done? Has anyone pulled the lock cylinder from Nancy Guthrie's front door and looked at the pins under a scope? If the answer is yes, the results have not been made public. If the answer is no, if that lock cylinder is still sitting in an evidence bag somewhere without having been examined at that level of detail, then a potential confirmation of entry method is sitting untouched. Win Yates made one more point that reframes the January 11th visit entirely. If someone stood at Nancy Guthrie's front door on that date, and the porch camera recorded exactly that, one of the things they could have been doing, in addition to everything else, was assessing the lock, identifying the model, confirming the pin count, determining which picking method would be fastest and quietest when they came back. 20 days of preparation, and on the night of January 31st, they already knew exactly what they were walking up to. The door was never the obstacle everyone thought it was. It was just a lock. And locks, as it turns out, are only as strong as the assumption that no one has learned how to open them. There is a version of this investigation where everything is proceeding exactly as it should, where the FBI has the metadata, has analyzed the background lights, has matched the wheel measurements, has examined the lock cylinder, and is simply withholding that information for operational reasons because releasing it would compromise an active case, tip off a suspect, or collapse a prosecution before it begins. That version is possible. But there is another version, a version where critical digital evidence was overlooked, underanalyzed, or never properly collected in the first place. And the public record, as it stands tonight, gives us reason to take that second version seriously. Todd Shipley has spent 25 years in law enforcement working digital crime. He understands how investigators approach video evidence, what they prioritize, and where their blind spots tend to form. And when he looked at how the porch video was handled, he identified something that should concern everyone following this case. The investigators focused on the subject. That sounds obvious. Of course, you focus on the person in the frame. But in digital forensic video analysis, focusing exclusively on the subject is a methodology failure. The subject is one data point, the background is another, the lighting conditions are another, the shadows, the reflections, the objects partially visible at the edges of the frame, all of it is data. All of it can be cross-referenced against physical evidence, witness testimony, and external camera footage to build a timeline that a single subject-focused analysis will never produce. What the online community found in the background of that porch video, the lights, the apparent movement, the detail that suggests a second presence on that street, should have been identified in the first formal review of that footage. It wasn't. It took crowdsourcing. It took a user on X sitting with the video frame by frame, without law enforcement training, without forensic software, without access to the original uncompressed file. That gap is not a small thing. Now, here's what makes it worse. Every piece of digital evidence in this case, every video, every still image, every camera file pulled from every ring system in that neighborhood carries metadata, and that metadata has not been released. Metadata is not a technical abstraction. It is a timestamp with a source address. When a camera records a file, it embeds information directly into that file, the date, the time, down to the fraction of a second, the device that recorded it, sometimes the GPS coordinates of where the device was located. For a networked home security system, that metadata can also include server sync timestamps, connectivity logs, and activity records that exist independently of the video content itself. This matters enormously for two specific questions in the Nancy Guthrie case. The first is the January 11th footage. When that video surfaced later than it should have, under circumstances that raised questions about why it took so long to emerge, the metadata attached to that file would have confirmed or challenged the date stamp. If the camera's internal clock was accurate, if the server sync records matched, if the geolocation data placed that footage at the correct address, none of that has been publicly confirmed. We were told the date. We were not shown the verification. The second is the offline cameras. 2 cameras in the immediate neighborhood went dark on the nights of January 11th and January 31st. The neighbor discovered this not on his own, but during a review session with investigators, which means the investigators already knew. They had already flagged it. And the question that follows from that is one that has not been answered publicly. What caused those cameras to go offline? There are several possibilities. A power fluctuation, a router reset, a scheduled firmware update that happened to coincide with both dates. All of those are explainable, documentable, verifiable through the camera system's own server logs, or the cameras were deliberately disabled. Modern home security systems can be disrupted through signal jamming a device that floods the frequency used by wireless cameras, forcing them offline without physically touching the hardware. It leaves no visible evidence at the scene. It requires equipment that is, like the lockpick gun, more accessible than most people realize. And it would explain with precision why 2 cameras went dark on the same 2 nights, the nights when something was moving through that neighborhood. Has the FBI analyzed the network logs from those cameras? Has anyone determined whether the outages were caused by external interference? That analysis is possible. It is standard in digital forensic investigations of this type, and it has not been discussed publicly. Then there is the question of what other footage exists and hasn't been released. Sheriff Nanos has shifted his position on this more than once. First, there was nothing beyond the porch video. Then the January 11th footage emerged. Then references to additional images began surfacing. The pattern of disclosure in this case has been inconsistent in a way that either reflects a carefully managed investigative strategy or reflects an investigation that is discovering its own evidence in real time, which would be a serious problem at day 51. Shipley's point about the broader digital picture is worth sitting with. These camera systems don't just record video, they log activity. They record motion triggers. They store connectivity data. a comprehensive digital forensic sweep of every network device in proximity to Nancy Guthrie's home. Not just the cameras, but the routers, the smart home devices, the cell towers that registered any phone active in that area on the relevant nights would produce a map of digital activity that no amount of physical evidence can replicate. That map either exists or it doesn't. If it exists, it hasn't been shared. If it doesn't exist, then the investigation has a gap in its digital evidence collection that grows more difficult to fill with every passing day. Because digital evidence doesn't wait, server logs get overwritten, cloud storage retention periods expire, cell tower records get purged on schedules that don't accommodate slow-moving investigations. Every day that passes without a formal preservation order on every piece of digital infrastructure connected to this case is a day that potential evidence moves closer to permanent deletion. 51 days. The metadata on that porch video could place those headlights at a precise moment in the timeline. The network logs from those offline cameras could confirm or eliminate deliberate interference. The cell tower data from the area around Escalante on the nights of January 11th and January 31st could identify every device that was active in that neighborhood during the relevant hours. That data either exists or it's already gone. And the public answer to that question, as of tonight, is silence. 51 days of searching. 51 days of press briefings, community vigils, yellow ribbons on palm trees, and a reward that has climbed to $1.2 million without producing a single public arrest. And tonight, for the first time, the individual pieces stop feeling like separate questions and start feeling like a single answer that nobody has said out loud yet. Let's build it from the ground up. Someone surveilled this neighborhood before January 11th. We don't know how long before, but by the time they appeared on that porch camera, they already knew the terrain. They knew the service road behind the properties. They knew the cut-through that school children had used for years. They knew which direction to approach from to avoid the cameras mounted on neighboring homes. They knew that Nancy Guthrie lived alone. They knew she no longer had a dog. That last detail is not incidental. It is operational intelligence. A dog changes everything about a forced entry. It creates noise. It creates unpredictability. It can alert neighbors before the operation is complete. The fact that Nancy's previous dog had passed and had not been replaced, that is not the kind of information you acquire by driving past a house once. That is the kind of information you acquire by watching, by asking questions, by knowing something about the rhythms of her daily life that goes beyond what a stranger could observe from the street. Someone knew. And they used what they knew. On January 11th, they returned. Not to take her not yet. To confirm. To walk the approach route in real time. To assess the lock. To identify the camera positions and determine which ones could be neutralized. The neighbor's dogs sensed something moving in the dark that night. The cameras nearest to that movement went offline. And 20 days later, the same approach, the same route, the same cameras dark, but this time, they didn't leave without her. Now think about the porch video with all of that context loaded in. The figure standing at Nancy Guthrie's front door is not nervous. He is not rushed. He pulls weeds from the doorstep with the kind of deliberate casualness that you cannot fake under genuine stress. That kind of calm only comes from preparation. From having done the mental rehearsal enough times that the physical execution feels familiar, he checks over his shoulder, not randomly, not out of paranoia, but at a specific moment, toward a specific point on the street, where lights are visible in the background of the frame. He was checking for confirmation. The car was in position. The operation was go. What happened inside that house, in the time between his arrival and the moment Nancy Guthrie was brought out that window, that specific period of time is the part of this case that has never been adequately addressed publicly. The blood. The wheel marks in the gravel that begin where the blood ends. The device that carried her narrow gauge, load-bearing, straight-line trajectory toward the street, that device was brought to this house. It did not belong there. Someone packed it, transported it, and deployed it as part of a planned extraction. This is not the behavior of an opportunistic crime. This is not a burglary that escalated. This is not a random act of violence against an elderly woman who happened to leave a door unlocked. This is an operation. And operations have architects. The figure on the porch executed. The driver waited with the vehicle. But somewhere behind all of it, behind the surveillance, behind the camera disruption, behind the logistical preparation that included bringing extraction equipment to a residential street, in the early hours of the morning, there is a person or persons who planned this, who identified Nancy Guthrie as a target, Who decided that the risk was worth taking and the reward was worth pursuing? What reward? That question is the one that this entire investigation has circled without landing on a definitive answer. Ransom has not been demanded publicly. No proof of life has emerged. No contact with the family has been confirmed. The traditional motivations for a kidnapping of this profile, financial, personal, retaliatory, have all been raised, and none have been resolved. And the silence around that question is the loudest thing in this case. Because organized, pre-planned operations targeting specific individuals do not happen without motive. The sophistication of the execution, the surveillance, the route planning, the camera disruption, the extraction equipment, the accomplice coordination, that level of preparation is not applied randomly. It is applied to a target that someone decided was worth that level of effort. Who decided Nancy Guthrie was worth that level of effort? And why? The FBI is working this case. That is not nothing. Federal resources, federal jurisdiction, federal forensic capacity. If the evidence exists to be found, they have the tools to find it. The metadata on that porch video, the network logs from the offline cameras, the cell tower activity on Escalante on the nights of January 11th and January 31st. The wheel measurement profile matched against equipment sourced in the Tucson area. The lock cylinder examined under magnification for pick marks. All of it is actionable. All of it is within the investigative capacity of the agency now running this case. But 51 days have passed, and Nancy Guthrie has not been found. The community has not stopped looking. The ribbons are still on the palm trees. The neighbors are still coming forward. The online researchers are still sitting with footage frame by frame, finding details that trained investigators missed. The family is still waiting. That is what this case has become at day 51. Not a mystery in the abstract sense, not a puzzle without pieces. The pieces are there. The surveillance timeline is documented. The approach route is identifiable. The entry method is no longer theoretical. The extraction equipment left its mark in the gravel. The accomplice left their headlights in the background of a video that the whole world has seen. The pieces are there. The question, the one that remains open tonight, the one that will remain open until someone with knowledge of what happened on Escalante decides that $1.2 million, or the weight of their own conscience, is finally enough, is not what happened to Nancy Guthrie. The question is who decided it should. If you know anything at all about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, please call 800-225-5328. To remain anonymous, 520-882-7463. The reward stands. The family is waiting. And this case is not closed. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this video. Keep the search alive. Because the only way cases like this get solved is when enough people refuse to look away. Nancy Guthrie deserves that. Her family deserves that. Don't look away.